the hidden reason spiritually awake people are withdrawing from life. Have you ever looked around and wondered why some of the most spiritually awake, deeply aware, and emotionally intelligent people seem to be retreating from life? Not in a dramatic "I'm done with this world" kind of way, but in a quiet, almost ghost-like withdrawal, like they're slowly fading into the background of society. You notice them, the ones who used to be vibrant, expressive, and deeply involved. Now they speak less, they show up less, and their presence feels like a whisper. And the strangest part is, they're not depressed. They're not bitter. They're not even angry. In fact, they seem more at peace than ever. So why are they slowly disappearing? This isn't just a modern phenomenon. It's an ancient pattern, echoed in nearly every spiritual tradition. The mystics, the monks, the sages, they withdrew. But today, in the age of hyperconnectivity, where every thought is posted, every opinion shouted, and every moment captured for validation, this withdrawal feels eerie. It feels like a quiet rebellion. And that's exactly what it is. A rebellion not against the world, but against noise, against illusion, against the lie we've all been sold about what it means to be alive. Here's the hidden reason. When someone becomes spiritually awake, they begin to see through the fabric of social reality. They realize that so much of what we chase, status, attention, identity, even purpose, is constructed. Not false, necessarily, but built on sand. The spiritually awake person no longer finds nourishment in the things that once sustained their ego. And once your ego loses interest, your energy shifts. You retreat not out of fear or depression, but out of clarity. You see the machinery behind the curtain, and you choose silence over spectacle. But let me ask you something personal. When was the last time you felt truly alive in the presence of the world? Not just stimulated or entertained, but deeply alive, like your soul was vibrating with resonance. If it's been a while, you're not alone. Because once you taste real awareness, superficial engagement starts to feel like eating cardboard. And that's what spiritually awake people start to experience, a spiritual palate cleanse. Suddenly, the conversations that once thrilled them feel hollow. The goals that once inspired them feel mechanical. The social dynamics that once felt like the arena of life now feel like a game of shadows.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
This isn't about superiority. It's not that the spiritually awake feel better than others. In fact, it's often the opposite. They feel more connected than ever, but not in a way that makes them want to jump into the crowd. They feel connected like roots to the earth, not like fireworks to the sky. And so they begin to walk differently, speak differently, and yes, live differently. They may still show up at work, still laugh at jokes, still engage in society, but something has shifted. The inner engine that once drove them to seek approval, to win, to prove, to compete, it's gone. And without that engine, they move with a strange kind of stillness. You might be feeling this too. Maybe you've started pulling away from certain people, not because of conflict, but because something in you no longer resonates. Maybe you've stopped chasing certain dreams, not out of failure, but because they no longer feel like your dreams. Maybe you've become quieter, and it confuses the people around you. They ask if you're okay, if something's wrong. But nothing's wrong. In fact, perhaps for the first time, everything feels strangely right, even if it's unfamiliar. But here's the paradox. Awakening doesn't make you want to fix the world. It makes you want to understand it. And in understanding, you realize that most of the world doesn't want to be fixed. It wants to be felt. And so, instead of preaching, you start listening. Instead of reacting, you start observing. And instead of fighting for attention, you start dissolving into presence. But it's not that you don't care. It's that you care so much, you no longer want to feed the illusions. You want to feed the soul. And sometimes, feeding the soul means stepping away from the feast of distractions. But let me ask you this. What if our cultural definition of life is actually a distraction from being? What if real living isn't found in constant motion, but in stillness? In awareness? In simply existing without needing to become anything else? Would you still chase the same things you're chasing now? Would you still surround yourself with the same people? Would you still post the same things, say the same words, wear the same masks? This is the uncomfortable truth that spiritually awake people begin to face, that much of what we call life is actually performance. And when you wake up, you stop performing, not to be dramatic, but because the script no longer fits. The costume itches, the lights burn your eyes, and the applause feels hollow. You don't hate the play, you just realize it's not your story anymore. And so, the withdrawal begins. Not all at once. Not with a grand announcement. But slowly, quietly. Like a river returning to the sea. The silent revolution. Why spiritual awakening feels like losing everything before finding yourself there, comes a moment in every spiritual journey, a moment so raw, so disorienting, that it feels like the world is collapsing. Not outside of you, but within you. It's not a breakdown in the traditional sense. It's not panic or chaos. It's more like the quiet disassembly of everything you once believed yourself to be. The stories you told about who you are, what you want, what matters, they start to unravel. It's like waking up and realizing you've been living inside someone else's dream. And instead of relief, there's an eerie, almost painful stillness. Because now, for the first time, you're not sure where you end and the world begins. This is the silent revolution. A revolution that doesn't shout, doesn't march, doesn't post declarations on social media. But it happens in the unseen corners of your being. And it begins with a loss, not of possessions or people, but of identity. You begin to shed layers, not because you want to, but because you have to. You can no longer carry the weight of who you pretended to be. And in that shedding you feel naked, vulnerable, alone. Not because others have left you, but because you've started to leave the version of yourself that others knew. Have you ever stood in front of the mirror and not recognized your own reflection, not physically, but existentially? Like the person staring back at you is a costume that no longer fits. That's the moment. That's the revolution. And it's terrifying. Because we've been taught that who we are is defined by consistency, by being the same person day after day. But spiritual awakening is the opposite. It's a death of repetition. A collapse of the old self to make room for something deeper, something more true, something that doesn't need validation to exist. And here's the kicker, there's no roadmap, no instruction manual, no spiritual GPS telling you where to go. All you have is your intuition, your inner knowing, and for most of us, that voice has been buried under years of noise. So now, in this newfound silence, that voice begins to whisper. At first, it's so faint that you can barely hear it. But the more you listen, the louder it becomes. And it doesn't speak in logic. It speaks in resonance, in feeling, in a kind of deep knowing that doesn't come with words. But this is where the real challenge begins. Because as you start to listen to that voice, you begin to see how much of your life was built on ignoring it. Jobs, relationships, routines, even principles you once defended, they start to feel misaligned. And so the loss deepens. You may leave a career you spent years building. You may distance yourself from friends who no longer reflect your truth. You may feel like an alien in your own life, surrounded by people who still operate in the dream you've just awakened from. This is why spiritually awake people begin to withdraw. Not because they've given up, but because they're recalibrating. They're learning how to live from the inside out. And that process requires solitude, not isolation, but sacred solitude. Time to listen, to feel, to rebuild a life that reflects who they really are, not who they were told to be. And this takes courage, because the world around you will not understand. They'll ask why you're acting differently, why you're less available, why you're not yourself anymore. And the truth is, you aren't. You've outgrown the costume. But here's a deeper question. What if losing everything you thought you were is the only way to remember who you really are? What if the unraveling is not destruction, but revelation? What if the silence isn't emptiness, but a doorway? Could you walk through it, even if it means walking alone? And maybe that's the most radical part of awakening, that it doesn't add anything to you. It takes things away, illusions, attachments, identities. And beneath all that rubble, something ancient emerges. A presence, a stillness, a sense of being that doesn't need to perform, doesn't need to prove, doesn't need to belong, because it already is. And in that being, you finally feel at home. Beyond the noise, how stillness becomes the loudest revolution. There is a kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't walk into a room and command attention. It doesn't try to win arguments or dominate conversations. But it doesn't need applause or followers or a platform to validate its existence. This power moves differently. It is quiet. It is still. It listens more than it speaks. It observes more than it reacts. And yet, its presence is undeniable. It shifts the energy of a space simply by existing. This is the power of stillness, and for the spiritually awake, it becomes their revolution. In a world addicted to speed, noise, and urgency, stillness is a rebellion, a passive withdrawal, but a conscious refusal to participate in a system that thrives on distraction. When you become spiritually awake, you begin to see how much of modern life is designed to pull you out of yourself, how every scroll, every notification, every dopamine spike is part of a larger architecture of avoidance. Avoidance of presence, of discomfort, and of stillness, because stillness is where truth lives. And most people are terrified of that kind of truth. But what is stillness really? It's not just the absence of movement or sound. It's the presence of awareness. It's being so rooted in this moment, so deeply present with yourself, that the noise of the world no longer defines your reality. In stillness, you begin to hear what can't be heard among the chaos. You begin to feel what's been numbed by constant stimulation. It's like tuning into a frequency that's always been broadcasting, but you were too busy changing stations to notice. This is where the spiritually awake begin to live, not in the frenzy of headlines or the theater of performance, but in the quiet, sacred space between thoughts. And from that space, a new kind of clarity arises. You begin to see people, really see them, not their personas, not their masks, but their essence. You also begin to see the suffering they carry, often masked as ambition, productivity, or confidence. You see the fear behind their smiles, the loneliness in their busyness, the longing buried beneath their achievements. And instead of judging, you feel compassion, because you've been there too. But you also realize something else, that you can't save people from their illusions. You can only model another way of being. And that's why stillness becomes the loudest revolution. Because in your silence, in your peace, in your refusal to chase what doesn't nourish your soul, you become a mirror, a disruption, a living contradiction to everything the world tells us we need to be in order to be worthy. You become the question that others didn't know they were afraid to ask. What if everything I've been chasing is a distraction from who I already am? And so, you start to live differently. You move slower. You speak with more intention. You stop trying to convince people and start embodying truth. You measure success not by what you acquire, but by how deeply you love, how fully you're present, how authentically you express. You start choosing experiences that expand your soul instead of inflate your ego. And you begin to understand that the most radical act you can perform in a society built on noise is to become quiet, still, awake. But this path is not without cost. You will lose things, but you will lose people, not because you push them away, but because your energy no longer aligns. And sometimes that loss will ache. You'll question yourself. You'll wonder if you're becoming too removed, too detached, too different. But then, in that solitude, in that stillness, you'll feel something deeper than anything you've ever known. A wholeness, a peace, a sense of belonging not to a tribe or a trend, but to existence itself. So ask yourself, what would your life look like if you stopped running from stillness? What would happen if you stopped chasing validation and started trusting your own presence? Could you live a life so rooted, so quiet, so real that your very existence becomes a revolution? Dissolving the self, why the final stage of awakening is not becoming more, but becoming less. There is a profound irony at the heart of the spiritual journey. For most of our lives, we are conditioned to believe that growth means addition. That to become someone of value, we must add more knowledge, more experiences, more achievements, more identity. But the final stage of awakening reveals a hidden truth. Real growth is not about becoming more, it's about becoming less. Less attached, less identified, less entangled with the stories that once defined you. The spiritually awake don't grow by stacking layers on top of their being, they grow by peeling them away, one illusion at a time. The ego resists this. It wants to build. It thrives on complexity, on being someone. But awakening is not about becoming someone. It's about realizing you were never anyone to begin with. That what you truly are cannot be named, cannot be named, cannot be captured in a role or a narrative. You are not your job, your relationships, your traumas, your triumphs, or your timeline. You are the awareness behind it all. And as that realization deepens, the desire to be anything in particular begins to fade. Not out of apathy, but out of liberation. This dissolution of self doesn't mean you stop functioning in the world. It doesn't mean you stop creating, loving, or participating. But your relationship to it all changes. You no longer act from a place of I need to prove my worth. You act because something true wants to move through you. You no longer pursue things as a means of identity construction. You engage with life as a form of presence, as a dance, as a sacred play. And you start to see that the more you dissolve, the more fully life can flow through you. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack for decades, filled with your beliefs, your wounds, your ambitions, your image. Then one day you realize you don't need it anymore. You set it down, and for the first time you feel light, not because you gained something, but because you let go. That's what it's like to dissolve the self. You're not disappearing, you're unburdening. You're making space for something far more mysterious to emerge, your essence. And here's where it gets even more paradoxical. The less you try to be someone, the more you become everything. Not as an identity, but as a presence. You walk into a room and people feel something different about you. Not because you're loud, but because your silence carries depth. Not because you shine, but because your stillness reflects their own hidden light. You become a mirror for others, not by trying to help them, but by simply being what they've forgotten they are. That's the power of someone who has dissolved their need to be anything. But there's a question that haunts this stage. If I'm not my thoughts, my emotions, my identity, then what am I? And the answer is not something you can grasp with the mind. It's something you feel in the quiet moments when you're no longer striving. It's the awareness that looks out through your eyes. It's the spaciousness that hears your thoughts but isn't defined by them. It's the still presence that has been with you through every stage of your life, unchanged, unnoticed, infinite. But that is what you are. And so, the withdrawal from life isn't really a withdrawal. It's a return. A return to what was always here, waiting beneath the noise. Spiritually awake people aren't disappearing from life, they're re-entering it from a deeper place. A place where life is not a performance, but a presence. Where meaning is not manufactured, but discovered in stillness. Where the self is not built, but surrendered. So I leave you with this. What would happen if you stopped trying to become someone and simply allowed yourself to be? Could you let go of the story long enough to feel the truth beneath it? Could you dissolve into life and find that in losing yourself you finally come home? And maybe, just maybe, that's the hidden reason spiritually awake people are withdrawing from life, not because they've given up, but because they've finally arrived.